I find myself frustrated by political discourse at the moment because it seems we just keep running into walls. No matter how we advance the arguments, no matter how persuasively we make our case, we are met with rote-learned talking points by mainstays in the conservative establishment who refuse to concede any ground to us, but have conceded ground to our enemies over decades, to the point of where Gen Z has inherited a series of political catastrophes for which their elders have no answers. And the moment that the Zoomers challenge the taboos that have constrained political action for those same decades and say, why don't we just take power and do something about it, Anakin Skywalker style, then they are the ones targeted by their own side as the real threat. As if the real problem with the far left is that they're going to give rise to the far right, and they're really scary. The real problem with living in Weimar Germany is that it ended up in Nazi Germany. Not that Weimar Germany in and of itself was bad, and should be prevented if you don't want to live in Nazi Germany. No. The real bogeyman over the hill for establishment conservatives, the GOP, the Republican Party, and even their analogues on my side of the pond in Great Britain, their real greatest fear is young white men who actually believe what they say and use political power to enact that. And this is represented by the recent primaries in Florida. One such primary, actually, because Dan Bilzerian is not exactly a serious actor. But James Fishback, he was a social media candidate. He was mocked for having his campaign be quite sensationalist. But it's undeniable that he captured the imagination of a large amount of young Republicans in the state of Florida. As The Atlantic laments, Fishback actually matters because he managed to figure out at least one thing: how to capture attention from the youthful right. Heading into election night, this was the one area where Fishback appeared to excel. A February poll from the University of North Florida found Fishback to be the leading candidate among GOP primary voters under 35, with 31% supporting him. By July, that number was up to 51%, according to a Change Research poll paid for by the conservative non-profit Freedom Project USA. Fishback's candidacy was, in some respects, a test run from what might work with the next generation of Republican voters. And they say what seems to be working is unrepentant bigotry, but no, it's taking your own side. It's refusing to give your country away to anyone from anywhere that shows up and would like a handout, or who might prospectively be grafted into the American people because they put their hand on any book, doesn't have to be the Bible, say the Pledge of Allegiance that they could abandon seconds after, and declare themselves to be devoted to American values which the Founding Fathers would not recognize. And the people that say this is the case are the liberals on the right, which is the Republican establishment, or again, the British conservative establishment, who say that anyone from anywhere can become one of your countrymen, they are entitled to your inheritance, just as if they identified as a member of your family and wrote themselves into your parents' will, robbing you of your actual home. And so the politics that is being represented by the likes of the embryonic insurgent force of James Fishback, and again, I've got no say on the matter, I don't live in Florida, I'm not an American voter, but the campaign does represent that youthful energy that wants to take its own side, that recognises that every group is allowed to play identity politics at the heritage populations of our respective countries' expense, while we are discouraged from doing so by our own side who say, don't play identity politics, that's what the left wants. You are playing into division, as if there were some original position where we could be united with everyone from everywhere if we just stopped seeing skin colour and abided by the sanitized version of Martin Luther King's vision encapsulated in I Have a Dream speech and literally nowhere else in his body of work. Instead, what young men want is a their country first, America first foreign policy, not entangling ourselves in faraway conflicts in lands full of people that hate us, invading their country, then importing them by the millions. They want an end to mass migration, a reversal of unwanted, undesirable demographic and cultural change. They want to grow up in the neighborhoods that felt familiar to them in their childhood and hand those off to their own children. They want things to be affordable again, rather than printing loads of money to squander on welfare, babysitting the third world in our countries, or foreign aid in their countries, or marshalling our military forces to go and do regime change in their countries, which doesn't last all of 5 minutes, but costs plenty of our country's blood and treasure. They want reindustrializing, they want prosperity, they want peace, they want a patrimony to hand down to their descendants, they want to honour the sacrifices made by their ancestors and claim exclusive rights to their country, to control their own political and demographic destinies. All those things are reasonable demands, and if right-wingers, on their ostensible side, won't secure that for them, then they have nothing to offer them, and just calling them names will not change their minds. Sure, some of it's performative for social media. Some of it is just because they get a buzz from all the hype edits. You know, maybe the Sonnenrads aren't helping, guys. But Schadenfreude and sensationalism is just hyperbole for the majority wanting to take their own side and therefore engage in the zero-sum game of political representation, and if they see the other side losing, then they see that as a win for their side. And they're doing that because the other side is playing that way too. Because the Democratic Socialists of America are not socialists. They are third world ethnic partisans who hate white people and want to steal their stuff. That's the same with the new Arab guy in Michigan. It's with Zoran Mamdani. It's the same with a black woman who wipes her hands on the American flag. It's the same with AOC and the rest of the squad. Rashida Tlaib, who is just a partisan for Palestine. Ilhan Omar, who wants to defraud the American taxpayer so Somalis can send money back home in remittances to their failed country. These people just hate white people and want to take their stuff. It is an ethnic extraction racket, not a retranslation and elucidation of Marxian economic theory. They recognize that the people that they have been forced to pay, to import and house at their expense, who have been given unfettered access to the political system despite having nothing but contempt for the country and the people in it, they recognize they are playing a zero-sum game of ethnic patronage, and so they would like to meet like for like because they think they're going to win, because they're the majority population, because their civilization has been the most ingenuitive, prosperous, powerful in all of history. The American Empire displaced the British Empire, which was the heir to the Roman Empire and the nation-states of Greece and the Holy Roman Empire and and Christendom, which spanned the entire Western world. All of these things come from European civilization, especially the Anglos. And so if the Anglos take their own side, well, we're going to win. And the only way we don't get to take our own side is if the gatekeepers on our side say to young people who have been shut out of those institutions, you don't get to come in until you are sufficiently sanitized, liberal, colorblind, and incapable of defending yourself, as we have failed to defend ourselves and you for the last few decades, therefore allowing the left to run roughshod with their ethnic resentment and their sexual perversion in every institution. They didn't even need to do a long march, they just sprinted right through the halls and we didn't stop them. But first, this video is sponsored by Rumble Wallet. Britain is fast becoming the Soviet Union, where everything you say or buy online is being watched for potential wrongthink, and despite the Constitution, my friends across the pond in the United States aren't faring much better either. That's why libertarian nerds invented crypto, so you can have a say over your funds and what you spend them on. After the 2008 financial crash, Bitcoin was designed to be an alternative to banks, so that you couldn't be debanked, have transactions denied, services withheld, or funds put on hold. If you've ever been refused a bank account because you're a politically exposed person, you know how frustrating that is. Which is why the guys at Rumble have developed Rumble Wallet, to simplify your crypto transactions and make sure you remain uncancelable. You can use Bitcoin, dollar-backed stablecoins, or even digital gold backed by real gold. It connects with MoonPay, which is registered with the Financial Conduct Authority. So you can safely link your debit card, credit card, or bank account and be ready to use it within minutes. And for a limited time, you can start your Rumble wallet with $20 in US stablecoin. You can use that to tip your favorite Rumble creators, like me. Just enter my exclusive promo code Connor20 when you sign up. Rumble ensures we all have a platform to speak about the threats facing our respective countries without the fear of cancellation. They're good guys, and if they weren't doing the right thing, I wouldn't be working with them. So thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Download Rumble Wallet, try it for yourself, and remember to use my code Connor20 for $20 in US stablecoin to tip to your favorite creators. Restrictions apply. There are a limited number of entries available. Terms and conditions also apply. See the description below or visit rumble.com/promo official rules for details. And if you want to get all of my content without ads, you can subscribe to my Substack for as little as £5 per month. It's linked down in the description, and it's also where I'm posting exclusive essays and updates. Now let's get back to the video. Like it or not, immigration restriction, nativism, nationalism, economic protection, taking your own side, is the future of the right, as a response to the anti-white, third-worldist, dirtbag, resentful left. And if the liberal gatekeepers on the right can't get on board with that, they need to get out of the way. But they won't. And so an op is being run to purge the American right of all of these youthful, exuberant radicals who are the heirs to the Trump revolution, by using the term Groyper, fans of Nick Fuentes, as a new slur, the new bogeyman, to launch a witch hunt against any Capitol Hill staffer, member of a right-wing think tank, or anyone doing the same thing over here in Britain, who holds heterodox opinions on things like foreign conflicts, support for Israel, the impossibility of integration, and ethnicity and identity. Anyone who holds those opinions is persona non grata with the establishment right, even while the left embraces its murderous radicals who celebrated the killing of Charlie Kirk and who are open in wanting to impoverish the white middle class, tax whites at different rates than blacks, call it reparations, and as the Sam Hyde quote goes, brainwash and molest your children, kill you, see your blood running in the street, and laugh about it. This Politico piece caused quite a storm because it's just the op by the pre-Trump liberal Republicans who have felt under siege for a very long time, trying to identify their enemies as the Trump administration stumbles, mainly around the Iran war and inflation, and use it as an opportunity to regain control of the party, to do literally nothing, because to use power against your enemies would be unprincipled, and so they just forfeit the possession of all of the institutions that they claim to be so sacred over to their enemies, because to claim those institutions, to gatekeep against their enemies being in those institutions, would not be liberal, and it would violate their principles, so they become the beautiful losers that Sam Francis always warned about. And you can see it in the framing. The grown-ups are worried, implying that these are just a bunch of rambunctious toddlers running riot in a creche somewhere. In group chats and at happy hours, some GOP veterans fret about the rising generation of young staffers in their party. The recurring complaint, the pipeline that feeds young conservative talent into government jobs is defective, if not broken. Yeah, that's because you were engaging in the exact same DEI as your purported enemies were for years. You were desperate, as with Byron Donalds, actually, in Florida, to get young black people in roles to court the black vote, to break them free from the Democrat plantation, because the brothers are really going to vote red this time, and this is why you gave millions of dollars to Candace Owens, and you basically created your own monster for that. The recurring complaint from young people is they have been shut out of the institutions which should be there to safeguard their country and their prosperity, in favour of you making inroads with the client blocks of your enemies who aren't voting for reasons of ideology or values. They're voting for reasons of, I want more of my people imported, and I want more stuff to be taken from you and go to me. And you don't have an answer for that. This isn't the standard middle-aged lament that the kids aren't alright. It's a criticism aimed at institutions like the Heritage Foundation that purport to identify and train the party's future governing class. To conservative critics in and out of government, many of whom ascribe to more traditional pre-MAGA Republican beliefs, no, that the traditional American beliefs would be the beliefs of the Founding Fathers, whose first act was to restrict citizenship to free-born white persons of good moral character, who conceived of America as a union of Christian nations. That would be the different denominations of Christendom. That is not Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs and goat herders from the foothills of Afghanistan or the zombie apocalypse of Mogadishu. The Founding Fathers would not have had your ideas. And you thinking that the Founding Fathers were just 90s shitlibs, and therefore the GOP should emulate that 90s shitlibbery, is an anachronism in and of itself. Going back to that is electoral and national poison. But they complain that some such institutions have spent the last decade selecting for rigid conformity to Trumpist ideology over more typical markers of expertise. No, you had rigid conformity to neoconservative, socially liberal doctrine beforehand. Anyone who was unwilling to concede demographic and cultural ground to the enemy was purged from those institutions. It was basically impossible to get an immigration restrictionist in the American Enterprise Institute, for example. It was really difficult to get the GOP to train up any young staffer that wasn't just a clone of William F. Buckley Jr. This is why American Moment was founded, in large part inspired by J.D. Vance. It's why they trained up a bunch of people that fed through to Capitol Hill. That far more than a bunch of the other organizations like America First Policy Institute. They have populated the State Department, the White House, other bureaucratic institutions with Zoomers that have been trained to know how to wield power and in whose good that power should be wielded, and that is not the universal concern for everyone around the world. They do not practice this sort of Straussian doctrine of lying to the American public to spread secular Enlightenment values. They instead have an in-group preference. They care about their families, their congregation, their community, their country, their side. And that is totally reasonable. And if you're telling them, well, you shouldn't take your own side, while the enemy is very clearly taking their own side against them, promising to take everything they have and leave them dead, then you're offering them suicide rather than a viable political project. Everyone knows what the problem is, one source tells Politico. The organizations that bring young staffers to Washington, D.C. have spent the last decade prioritizing blind ideological loyalty instead of competence or intelligence. We have a generation of rabid, incompetent idiots. Of specific concern are those labeled Groypers, the followers of Nick Fuentes, though, as the Politico article admits, it's also used as a catch-all term of abuse for young anti-establishment right-wingers akin to the use of neocon in the other direction. Right, so it's a slur. It's a slur you're using to gatekeep people out of politics that don't hold your very narrow band of liberal ideals. The same thing is happening in the UK. Baroness Claire Fox, who used to write for Living Marxism, now spiked online, at an event hand-wringing about Nick Fuentes' interview with Tucker Carlson, said, well, shouldn't we be gatekeeping against all of these young identitarians and ethno-nationalists and British versions of Groypers, just as the boomers in corporate America should have gatekept against the woke left?
I think it's slightly different here. It's much smaller, but there's a rise of a very nasty pseudo-intellectual ethno-nationalism that is very similar. And I've been following the Nick Fuentes thing for a few years, and I work with a lot of young people. Anyway, that's that bit.
So where do you see it here?
I see it all over the place. I mean, when you work with kind of, 18 to 30-year-olds, which is where I work, a few years ago I started to spot these people. And I thought, God, who the hell are they? Right? And it's difficult because we've all been called Nazis and racists, promiscuously used at the drop of a hat. So then there's a difficulty of even discussing it, because if you start saying they're racist, people go, oh, we're all racist now. They go, oh, they're a bit far right, and they go, we're all far right now. And I understand, but it makes it difficult. Anyway, my question, because actually, genuinely, I don't know what to do either, but I'm here because it's so important, is that the generational question. Because it does seem to me that a lot of the reason for the complacency in this country, and even in America, is that older people feel like, a bit like this is a reflection of the left's progressives, think, oh, we're all dinosaurs and old, and these are the young kids on the block, right? So maybe we can, regenerate ourselves and rejuvenate ourselves by hanging out with these young people. Heritage thinks, oh, young people are not going to take any notice of us, but, well, maybe we'll have a few of the new kids in. And I do think that's exactly what's happened on the, all the institutions in society, where the old CEOs and so on go, oh, it's all the young people in the organisation, and they take over. So I think that we're seeing it a bit here. I assume that's what's happening in America, why the older people haven't got the courage to call them out because they don't want to alienate themselves. Is that fair? I'm not saying all young people, of course, but,
Because I know the thing that institutions are suffering from, especially on the British right, is too many young people. Absolutely insane. What's happening here is they're identifying, as Rod Dreher did, lots of people as Groypers, either in a language game to put them all in a box and say these people are reprehensible, a basket of deplorables, if you will, and push them down the river never to be seen again, or it's because they don't understand why these young people have come to the conclusions they have, and they aren't listening. And the reason is it's painful to listen because they are the products of the policies that you have been enacting and your failures to lead and prevent the left's total capture of the institutions. As the Politico piece says, they're also skeptical of military intervention more so than their forebears. The oldest members of Gen Z were toddlers on 9/11 and grew up in an era of multi-decade, multi-trillion-dollar wars and found themselves unable to afford homes as they reached adulthood. Many come by their mistrust of GOP orthodoxy honestly. For these young Republicans, their elders' complaints about their generation don't reflect genuine concerns over credentials and experience. They're about winning a debate within the Republican Party, or shutting down that debate, because sometimes containment just requires not having you participate in the conversation. As I've learned many times. One person says, from my experience, working on the ground, there is not this mass Groyper issue. This is Marty Burrito, who serves as president of the College Republicans of America. My suspicion is they're counting as Groyper anyone who's remotely anti-Israel. Rachel Bovard, VP of Programs at the Conservative Partnership Institute, who trains staff, said the Groyper criticism is gross and reprehensible, especially to do this to young Hill staff. Now, I'm not using Groyper as a slur. I think it's disingenuous, bad faith, and I've got no particular problem with Nick Fuentes. Don't know the guy. I watch his clips and they're amusing. Nevertheless, it is clear this is an op being used to gatekeep young staffers out of the GOP, to salami slice off anyone who threatens the liberal establishment hegemony, and also to sabotage J.D. Vance's chances at becoming the presidential nominee come 2028, even though Nick Fuentes and J.D. Vance are kind of mortal enemies because Nick Fuentes has been very critical of him. This is a sort of pincer movement, because you have the Vance critics from the right, who, okay, raise some fair questions, even though I think Vance, on the whole, is a pretty good guy, and then the Vance critics from the establishment GOP, who would cream their pants if Ted Cruz were elected God Emperor for life. This piece actually cites Rod Dreher's estimate that 30 to 40% of Gen Z congressional and administration staffers are Groypers. Now, I actually spoke to Rod about this when he was over in Britain late last year, and I said, what I think you're doing is you're misidentifying a suite of beliefs that have come from the failures of the conservative establishment as just being imbibed from Nick Fuentes' Rumble show. You don't need to be a devotee of Fuentes' live streams to come to the conclusion that foreign intervention in the Middle East has failed, that Israel hasn't always acted prudently, that there seems to be a support for Israel as a nation state for Jewish people, but not America as a state for exclusively the American people, you know, pre-Second World War or pre-Heart-Cellar or even pre-Civil War Americans. And Britain for the British people, the English, Scottish, Welsh and Irish, or WISE, as the acronym Carl Benjamin has been using, goes. You don't need to watch specific creators to come up with these conclusions, because those specific podcasters also came to those conclusions from their own reading. It's in the cultural milieu. All you need to do is pay attention to politics and look past the liberal mysticism that says anyone can be an American or a Brit, that says that we need to support this country over here having something that we can't allow ourselves to have, that says that free markets and outsourcing our manufacturing has been nothing but an unalloyed good, and any suggestion to the contrary is Soviet socialism, and that still remains our greatest threat, rather than the inevitable consequences of importing tribal hostile minorities into your country and giving them unfettered access to your welfare state and your political system. And Nick Solheim, who's the CEO of American Moment, good guy by the way, is quoted in this piece saying, "The young men we bring to DC are not Groypers. They think Nick Fuentes is a black pillar and a charlatan." Again, I'm not going to throw out insults. "They want to see order restored in this country. They want mass deportations, no new wars, and the American worker and family uplifted." Okay, those platform pledges are identical to what Nick Fuentes wants, and they're not the exclusive property of Nick Fuentes. Now, some people are trying to have Nick Fuentes' movement without Nick Fuentes, but the point that Nick Solheim is making is that these are points of political principle. And what the conflation of those reasonable, popular points, those are the points that President Trump won, not just the House and the Senate on, and the presidency in the 2024 election, but the popular vote. It's not just that agenda, which he has unfortunately in some instances betrayed with the Iran war, or in other instances failed on with mass deportations, not going nearly as far as they need to. But it's also the thing that the Republican establishment abhors. They don't want it. They want more cheap foreign labour on H1 and H2Bs. They want more illegal farm workers. They want more demand for property to drive up the prices of housing developments. They want more offshoring manufacturing to drive down the cost of doing business. They want your country to turn into an economic zone, a revolving door for anyone to show up and send remittances back home. They don't care if your entire country becomes the airport queue at Dallas-Fort Worth, with a steady procession of Indians in wheelchairs just gaming the system to get on the plane first, even though it has a scheduled departure time. They don't care. If you do, they're going to call you a Groyper just to shut you out. This is an op. It is containment. It is a gatekeeping agenda. Do not fall for it. And as Nick points out, Rod's statistic of 30 to 40% is a rough estimate told in an anecdote from an anonymous source on his Substack, which was then printed in the Free Press, which was challenged by Emily Chasinski, who spoke to a bunch of Capitol Hill staffers, and they said that perhaps 30 to 40% of staffers know who Fuentes is, follow him for amusement, or treat his antics as a kind of dark political theatre, but few, if any, take his ideology seriously. So they don't follow Fuentes avidly, but they do have crossover of some of the things that he says, because mass deportations, repatriating manufacturing, getting demographic stability in America, considering they're about to become minority white, and they already are in Gen Z, you know, the generation that has to deal with these problems long after the boomers are dead, all of these things are just a normal popular political platform, and they're much more sensible to act on than the endless foreign wars, offshoring of manufacturing, and demographic indifference exhibited by GOP figureheads. They come to this conclusion because of the disparate experiences between boomers and zoomers with diversity, because the boomers had stable demographic foundations. They had a country that felt that it was always going to belong to them. It was stable, it was predictable. They had the psychological ease of walking around knowing basically everyone around them and how they thought, felt, lived, right? They knew they were Americans just like them. They thought that immigration and diversity would bring new restaurants and fun, fleeting cultural experiences that went no further than the food and the clothing. Whereas Zoomers have experienced diversity as reparations, kill whiteness, decolonization, DEI in colleges, shutting them out of job admissions. Of course, the grooming gangs in the UK, which undoubtedly are going to start cropping up in American cities, particularly Minneapolis, and Dearborn, Michigan, and people gloating that it's our country now. A bit like Bob Dylan in Britain saying, heard you want your country back. Nuh-uh, shut the fuck up. They see this as vindictive ethnic colonization by the newcomers that the boomers brought in to pay for their pensions, their welfare, their Medicaid, their Medicare, their social security, their cheap goods, their farm labor, and to staff their taco trucks. So, no, you're not going to get some sort of inclusive populist message. You're not going to get sort of Tucker Carlson's 10-point platform of vague platitudes, ignoring ethnicity, identity, racial tensions between blacks and whites, to focus on home building and affordable healthcare. You're not going to get that. Identity is most salient in politics when the pre-political we, the constituency in whose interest you are acting as a politician, cannot be defined, is disrupted. The boomers had a cohesive we. That's why they fought on the grounds of ideology or region or economics. It's why the Battle of the Cold War was a battle between economic ideologies in civilizations and within your own civilization, with Soviet sympathizers and free marketeers. And now, the primary battle is, do you get to have a country? No if you're white, yes if you're not. And no Zoomer, no self-respecting young white man is going to forfeit his ability to take his own side. He's going to vote for the furthest right option possible that represents his interests. And if you're going to call that Groypers, it's a disingenuous application of the term, and it will not discourage those young men from taking that option. Instead, you're just fulfilling your own prophecy. And they're going to gravitate towards those people that say, we're going to take power and use it in our group's interests, because groups already have power, because the Republicans have already allowed Indian, Hindu, and Jewish groups to collectively bargain for their own interests, even at the White House just this year. So they play identity politics for their preferred minority groups just as the left do, but they just don't allow the majority to play identity politics, even though it succeeds on both political sides. And young white men are going to gravitate towards people who say, our side is going to take power and use it in your interest, because otherwise the other side is going to take your power and use it against you. And it's because the world that has been built by both the left and the establishment right alike is intolerable. I mean, here's one piece. The anonymous author details the number of DEI scholarships and employment schemes that he encountered. He notes that white working class boys are one of, if not the most educationally disadvantaged groups in the country. The Centre for Social Justice highlighted this last year in their Lost Boys report, and on Monday, weeks just gone, the independent inquiry into white working class educational outcomes, co-chaired by Baroness Morris of Yardley, the former education secretary, warned the education system is not set up to serve white working class children and families. Despite achieving all A-star and A grades in his A-levels, the author had to turn down a confirmed place at one of the best London universities because the maintenance loan didn't come close to covering accommodation and living costs in the city. Financial schemes that might have closed that gap were the very ones I was shut out of on grounds of ethnicity. So scholarships are being made available for people on the grounds of skin colour rather than economic need. Because we just throw young white men by the wayside because of a culture of uplifting women or minorities on both the left and right. The right have done nothing to reverse this state of affairs. They only promise colourblind meritocracy instead, which, don't get me wrong, white guys would excel in, but they're still amenable to the special pleading by victim interest groups. So they are still going to be susceptible to those claims of inequality and oppression, even if they get into power. They are not yet impervious to demands for equality between ethnic groups. They still recognise them and feel the need to apologise or make concessions anyway, because that's what they've been doing for decades. And if you say, I don't care if this group or that group falls behind, I only care about my group, then you are accused of being woke right, a Groyper playing identity politics. You are the one that they seek to counter-signal instead. He said he was left with no other option but to take a gap year, deferring his studies, and it's been quite depressing as his friends have gone off to university while he's had to stay at home and work to save money when he eventually starts his degree in a couple of months in October. But now, looking ahead to see what training schemes, internships, and placements might be on offer when he's at university, he realises he'll face the same discrimination over and over again. He sees euphemisms for no white students buried at the bottom of adverts, and this despite the fact that recruiters such as the RAF have been named and shamed in recent years for discriminating against white men, useless white male pilots as they called them, in an effort to meet diversity targets. Take the security services, like GCHQ, the very place he had dreamt working for as a child. He glows. Which runs a 2-week summer training program that really appeals. It says that it's for math students from underrepresented groups, and specifies this means women and those from ethnic minority backgrounds. I went through previously how the intelligence services have been lobotomized by DEI and are running Muslim leadership award schemes and training schemes for the disabled. I actually think that our intelligence services, insofar as we have them, should be run by ruthlessly competent white guys who have no potential for loyalties to another country. We need to minimize that. Instead, all of our institutions are geared to pander to non-white grievances and the perverse sexual preferences of weird trans activists who have hostels in homeless shelters where they can play Minecraft, watch My Little Pony, and read Leninist literature. Why are we pandering to these people? Because the right hasn't put up a defense to say, this is your country, this is your inheritance, you should actually be privileged in your own country over other people who have other countries to privilege them. Because the right would say, that's identity politics, that's playing the victim, that's woke right, that's literally Nazism. It's pathetic. Now this guy also says later on, he is a gay man, and he's not against the idea of diversity and inclusion, and that encouraging women into spaces they were historically excluded from is DEI working as it should. And he supports it without reservation. Utterly carked, most mentally raped man alive. Nevertheless, but this points out that this guy isn't even at the bottom of the intersectional stack. There are people below this with an even worse experience. What are the right doing to speak to those young men? Nothing. Where are their young representatives? They can whine about Nick Fuentes all they like. Who else is speaking to young white men as young white men, giving them an encouraging message? Jordan Peterson, after his bout of illness during lockdown, came back and started talking about generalized politics. He was dragged off mission and became less effective because of it. And so in that vacuum, of course, people are going to step up and speak to young men's concerns. And it's not that just young men are economically desperate and disenfranchised and don't have girlfriends, and that's why they're attaching themselves to charismatic podcasters like Nick Fuentes, or Tucker Carlson is often spoke about as someone like this as well. But I mean, Tucker only ever speaks about Israel these days, and he seems to be flirting with non-identitarian economic populism and seems to be very pro-Muslim, so I don't get what the hell he's doing. But it's not because of desperation. It's because they're looking at the same set of political phenomena and accurately diagnosing it. And the right, people like Jeremy Boering and Ben Shapiro and Joel Berry and the rest of the Babylon Bee, and as we'll get onto in a moment, Rod Dreher, these people are looking at these phenomenons and saying, you can't do anything about it, because if you do, we'll call you woke right, a Nazi, we'll say that you are taking the first goose step towards the gas chambers, and we will stand in your way. We will hold your hands behind your back, while the DSA, which we've done nothing to stop, allows a bunch of resentful non-whites to take your stuff on the basis of race. And so you're offering nothing to young men. Nothing. And that's why they aren't following you. That Telegraph piece is an echo of Jacob Savage's viral article, The Lost Generation, from December of last year, and he points out that even while the Trump administration is trying to dismantle diversity, equity, and inclusion schemes in the public and private sphere, there has been an attempt to portray DEI as a series of well-meaning but ineffectual human resources modules. That might be how boomers and Gen X experience DEI, but for white male millennials and especially Zoomers, Jacob writes, DEI wasn't a gentle rebalancing, it was a profound shift in how power and prestige were distributed. It was a ethnic patronage network. Practically none of the thousands of articles and think pieces about diversity considered the issue by cohort, because the mandates to diversify didn't fall on older white men, who are still the establishment gatekeepers in the GOP, on the British right. Instead, they landed on young people. When young men have no investment in the system, and it refuses to invest in them, then why would they side with you when you're promising to just make the system work and preserve it? They're more likely to want to get rid of the system, rebuild it from first principles, rebuild it from the first principles that served their ancestors well, rather than the delusional Enlightenment ideologies of the French Revolution, or the fascists, or the Bolsheviks, and instead just revert back to when the country was run for them. It's not like this is a utopian idea. This was just how their country was run really, really well before the Second World War told them that they weren't allowed to have one, because they would turn into Hitler. And the people perpetuating that idea are also on the right, using the same talking points as the left, who like to call everyone Hitler, including those people who are calling people to their right Hitler. And if you want a prime example of how the establishment right can offer young men nothing, look no further than the absurd $20 burrito discourse that happened just a couple of weeks ago. Matt Walsh pointed out the grocery prices are insane, they're still rising. Addressing this problem should be the number1 priority of every elected leader. End the stupid foreign wars and focus on this issue. Walsh is dancing around landmines, not trying to get fired from the Daily Wire with comments like that. And he's saying it's one of the main reasons that socialists are gaining power. This is incontrovertible. If grocery prices are increasing, but money can always be found for more wars in the Middle East that are not going so well, then you're going to get an agenda that says, if we can print that money and spend it, why don't we just spend it on us rather than overseas? Especially when the narrative is that this is being spent on a genocide, and so it's hijacking people's compassion to not want to see fellow human beings exterminated, especially under the post-war morality that the liberals on the right also like to perpetuate too. And Andrew Colvett of Turning Point USA said, one TPUSA college student gave his take on affordability. A burrito shouldn't cost $20. A lot of this is hangover from COVID and Biden-era inflation, but the lived experience is the same. It just feels like basic things cost too much. If your middle class can't afford groceries that were far less expensive in the 90s, if their standard of living is needlessly being siphoned away because of political choices and appeals to relative poverty versus prosperity from the past, I mean, because these are the result of political choices and they are options, they won't cut through, they won't ease their frustration about how much things cost, then this becomes a really persuasive issue, especially when immigration is less salient as an issue, even though it should be more salient because the Trump administration hasn't done nearly enough to reverse the demographic decline of white America. But as immigration becomes a less salient issue, economics becomes a more salient issue, and if you're ceding ground on economics, then you're going to lose to the socialists who would just take all your stuff. And it's no use complaining about the rise of socialism in young people if you're not going to persuade them why you have something that is better for them, that's going to make it more affordable. Because you can, because socialism doesn't actually work. I'm not in favour of socialism, obviously. But if you can't market it better, and if your economic ideology has led to irresponsible spending by massive banks that get bailouts, trillions of dollars spent on foreign wars that you couldn't win, the offshoring of manufacturing, deaths from despair, the disempowerment of your native male population in their traditional industries, and their substitution by women filling out corporate spreadsheets with the corporation having no loyalty to them, discarding them when they hit their 40s and 50s with no family to show for it. What are you offering to young people? Nothing. And the reaction to this anodyne point, this useful point that GOP strategists should be taking on board was very revealing. For the likes of Eye Patch McCain, Dan Crenshaw, who said, hearing about this dumb $20 burrito debate, so just thought I'd make the losers on social media angry before going to bed. Because of course, a serious political leader does everything to piss off people on social media. To own the chuds! Yeah, great, thanks man. Stop whinging, get a job, eat ramen like the rest of us did in college on a budget with 4 roommates. The market doesn't care what you think something should cost, only communists care. They set prices, remember? Then everyone starves, remember? Are you a communist, or are you an American adult male capable of handling his own shit? If the government recklessly prints loads of money to give in aid packages to Ukraine or to other countries, and if they do so to lock down the economy and print stimulus checks, which both Trump and Biden did, and if you run basically a command economy because you take so much in taxes to spend on welfare for blacks and boomers, then how does the average American male take enough fiscal responsibility to hedge against all of that? If house prices are so inflated that the average age of home ownership now is well beyond the 30s in America, and the same thing sort of happening in the UK as well, if the government just keeps importing raw numbers of bodies by the millions every year who also need housing and healthcare and resources, If the demand keeps escalating, if inflation keeps going up and outpaces your ability to save responsibly, if you're doing everything right and the government's screwing you over anyway, then how is just saying, well, do you want price controls, you communist? You must want genocide of the kulaks. How is that persuasive? Absolutely useless. And Crenshaw, of course, got ratioed, community noticed, got loads of backlash about this. You got Shoe on Head in the comments. As per usual, Shoe coming out with gems of takes. Oh, you care about affordability? You can't afford a house and can't find a job? You expect better from your country and leaders? You believe things are possible? What are you, some kind of communist? No, it's just someone that realizes the country was run better a few decades ago and that all of this is optional. Despite getting ratioed into the Earth's core, Dan Crenshaw decided to turn around and say, okay, I am sorry for triggering the comment section. Of course the world is objectively harder than ever, and while the $20 burrito is rare, the fact that it exists anywhere is obviously proof that capitalism has failed. Lol, no, just kidding. Remember when the right had principles and made fun of leftists for elevating victimhood as a virtue? Want to tell people the truth, or just bribe them for their vote in the next election? The Founding Fathers' Declaration of Independence was literally a list of grievances. Grievances can be legitimate. Not everything is a victimhood narrative. You complete and utter fucking retard. Did losing an eye make you lose your brain too? And Dan Crenshaw also seems to find all the money down the back of America's couch for every war he would like to wage, but not enough to save responsibly, to pay down the national debt that's never going to get paid back, to ensure fiscal restraint can result in your groceries being more affordable. And you wonder why young people hate the establishment right. Most sour milk came from this lolcow, Joel Berry, who again just comes out with like total coal on the timeline. It's so much that Trump couldn't even clean it into beautiful clean coal. Joel Berry said, if you thought my $20 burrito feast for my family of 8 was nuts, this entire delicious meal cost me less than $10 from Aldi. Keep whining, losers. I'm eating like a king over here. And it's just a bowl full of Brussels sprouts and a few chicken drumsticks. This has like no fat, very low calories. If you're feeding a family of 8 with this, they're all going to be malnourished. Now, I understand this is hyperbole, it's just to own the chuds on social media, because Joel Perry's output, same with like James Lindsay and Dan Crenshaw's and a bunch of other people's, is entirely just to cause infighting on your own side, to paralyze the actual right against taking power, because you're so distracted by arguing with Joel Berry that you don't formulate plans to, win elections, use power, persecute your enemies, reward your friends. But this is so absurd, and people do see this on face value. And young people, if you're promising young people, hey, you can dumpster dive for scraps, you can spend $10 at Aldi for zero nutrition and feed your 8 children essentially chicken bones, then what? If prosperity and abundance is on the table, is possible because we have nuclear power, because America has vast fracking reserves, because it is the world empire, because it was very prosperous just a few decades ago, right? Because we have videos and footage of the 80s and 90s, which Zoomers didn't grow up in, and we have this sort of vicarious nostalgia for that era of stable demographics and a prosperous economy and entertainment that didn't suck and didn't hate us because of our race. If that is within reach, then you can't convince people that sucking the marrow out of some chicken bones is a more desirable vision of the future than whatever is being offered to get back to that place on the right. And it certainly isn't a bulwark against the South Africa or Lebanonization of America and Britain proposed gleefully by the anti-white left. And so this is why it was infuriating to watch this episode of Jeremy Boring's new podcast. I don't really know what the audience for this is, other than just Jay Burden and Dave Green and Aura McIntyre crashing out at the fact that despite all evidence, yet again, these platitudes have been recited as part of an influence operation over and over and over to gatekeep frustrated young white men, Groypers, out of the GOP. But Rod should know this, because I had this conversation with Rod like late last year, and I also did text Rod saying that sort of discourse around this podcast clearly got a lot of backlash for him, and so next time he's over in the UK, we can sit down and have a conversation about it. He's read the text, he hasn't responded yet, it was a few weeks ago, nevertheless. But Rod spent his time, despite claiming credit for bringing awareness to J.D. Vance's book Hillbilly Elegy, and he says basically launching his career, Rod spent his time saying that J.D. Vance could be the usher for the next Adolf Hitler, the American Hitler. That if we don't get a handle on all of these young white men who are really radical, then America could be truly lost. Because the worst thing that could happen is we stop being liberals. We don't revert to proper liberalism. Now, Rod Dreher has called himself a post-liberal for a long time. He was working in Hungary under Viktor Orban, who described himself as a post-liberal Democrat. And Now Rod has decided to say, well, post-liberalism actually means reverting back to classical liberalism from the metastasized, insane wokeness of liberalism, which also has somehow nothing to do with liberalism, according to James Lindsay, who is also a guest on Jeremy Boring's show. And the moment James Lindsay started talking, the dog threw up. Portents from the gods, I suppose. But Rod is saying, more liberalism is the answer to liberalism, and somehow the excesses of liberalism have nothing to do with liberalism. And despite us taking the side of certain identity groups in this discussion, you can't play identity politics even though we've shown that we are susceptible to identity politics. It's infuriating.
People became disconnected from traditions, from places, from institutions of society. Everything was in such turmoil, and people couldn't live with that chaos within themselves. And that created within the hearts and minds of the people a craving for order that the Bolsheviks and the Nazis stepped into. Now, it's also the case that it was the economic crash, the Great Depression, that brought on Nazism. But what the Great Depression did was unmask the deep, deep cultural rot that had been building or falling apart for the previous decade. And we're there, man. It was incredible to me what I learned about my own country today from reading about Weimar history.
I agree. We're living in Weimar conditions of hyperinflation and migrant sexual predation and just unbelievable levels of degeneracy and gender-bending perversion in all of our institutions. Maybe if the right had prevented that, or were proposing the use of government power to prevent that, we would also avert the disaster that you're implying is coming after it as a backlash to those Weimar conditions. Maybe if we agree on the diagnosis of the problems, we could propose a more healthy and wholesome solution that isn't just gas chambers and Auschwitz after the Autobahn. But instead, there is no solution proposed. It's just getting back to classical liberal values. It's just saying that anyone can declare themselves an American so long as they swear the Pledge of Allegiance, and if they violate that oath of naturalization, well, we can't denaturalize them because that would be mean. There's nothing substantive here. It's just endlessly diagnosing the problem on podcasts. When people actually try and take power, wield it, and solve the problem, suddenly they are the problem.
Last fall, I was getting ready to go to Washington for business. And a guy I know who's very active in conservative politics, an activist, a millennial, he said, listen, he doesn't live in D.C. He said, I'm hearing that in D.C., so many young men, like 30 to 40% of the young men who participate and work on the right in Washington are Groypers, followers of Nick Fuentes or some other similar radicals. And I find that hard to believe, but see what you can find out when you get there. So I arrived there, and this was not long after Tucker Carlson had platformed Fuentes, and I called Tucker out on it, and he ended our friendship, and fairly well. But every young man I met in their 20s, who, whether they work in the administration, for a think tank or whatever, for a member of Congress, I asked them, they all said yes. And one of these guys is a guy I happened to know beforehand, and he agreed, 30 to 40% sounds right. And I said, what do they want? He said, they don't want anything. They want to tear it all down.
No, not true. Not every young man working in politics is the Joker from The Dark Knight. How about you actually just talk to one of them? It's very conspicuous how all these conversations are had about this phenomena. You never actually sit down and talk to a young man about what he might want. And the reason is the very presence of that articulate, well-spoken, politically persuasive young man would repudiate your ideology because it has produced him, because your failures to address the problems he's concerned about, because your ideology has produced those problems, you would fail to be persuasive with your own audience. You'd lose credibility. And hey, if that's not the case, prove me wrong. Go talk to one of them. Any of them. There are a plethora of them gathering around the very bottom of the ladder in the right, because they have no funding, no institutional clout, and it's not for lack of talent. Lots of them are autodidacts, self-made men. They have their own audiences. Nick Fuentes is a creation of that cancellation process. Ben Shapiro sought to strangle his career in the crib, and now he's a very popular live streamer on Rumble, despite being cancelled from payment processors and put on a no-fly list and having multiple people come to his house and try to kill and harass him. Nevertheless, you could have any of these young men, it doesn't have to be Fuentes if you don't like him, any of these young men on your podcast and just ask them what they want. Because what they want, as Nick Solheim already laid out, is a country to call their own. Demographic security, cultural stability, not to be the target of derision by every institution and cultural product in the country, not to worry whether their kids are going to make it home because some drugged up troon has decided to take a pistol into the school bathroom that day. Not having all of their hard work confiscated in taxes to pay for welfare programs for single mothers in the ghetto and fraudster families imported from Somalia. To not have home ownership be impossible or a burrito to cost $20. And yes, of course, there are plenty of people in America who have reckless spending habits. I've seen enough of Caleb Hammer's financial audit to know that. But if you're not offering them a program to make the essentials more affordable, meanwhile, payment processors like Klarna are being promoted to get just endless fungible material goods, cheap, deferring the date at which you can pay it, then you're not offering these people a meaningful life. You're not offering them stability. You're not offering them a wholesome vision of the future. And so what they want is pretty clear. Demographic security, a country to call their own, not to be a hated minority in that country, economic stability, and the vision, and the ability to ride the subway or talk on a college campus without getting stabbed in the neck or shot at. All of those things should be possible. So why hasn't your ideology procured them? Why have things only gotten worse while you have held influence on the right?
Dude, this is Weimar. So when I went back to Europe, I buried myself in the history of 1920s Germany, the Weimar Republic, to see if there was anything we could learn from their experience. And it was extraordinary what I found. And I think a lot of us we Americans close our mind to the idea that we might be Weimar because Weimar always leads to Hitler. I don't think we're necessarily going to get Hitler 2.0. We might get Stalin 2.0.
Well, as I said, the Germans only got Hitler because they didn't get Stalin.
Yeah. And
once you reach a certain point, it's not a question of which totalitarian, it is only a question of which totalitarian comes in, right?
Great, you might want to avert that future by taking power and using it responsibly then, rather than refraining from using that power and refusing to touch, entitlements or the civil rights program or deporting millions of people who shouldn't be in the country. Maybe you should start ignoring all the institutions that have been captured by leftists who prevent you from doing that. Maybe you should start shutting down the extensive leftist activist patronage network and putting people in asylums who not just participated in the climate of stochastic terrorism leading up to the murder of Charlie Kirk, but who celebrated it and encouraged it to happen again to all of you, including you guys sitting on the sofa. That might be an idea to avert Hitler 2.0. And as for Stalin 2.0, I don't think you're going to get Stalin 2.0. I think it's going to have a distinct flavor that's more like Idi Amin or Robert Mugabe or Joseph Malema out in South Africa right now. You're going to get the American equivalent of the Kill the Boer song. Understand you're not dealing with a purely ideological Marxist enemy. You're dealing with seething ethnic resentment, and the only response to that is to take your own side, rather than call everyone a Nazi who's proposing to do that. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. Jeremy Boering, a few weeks later, then decided to mischaracterize Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction as third world tribalism repackaged as political theory. No. Distinguishing between people who support your way of life, your definition of what the good is, and people who want to see it driven to extinction, that is not a property exclusive to third world tribalism. That is just how politics works. And Schmitt, and you can tell Jeremy Boring hasn't actually read Schmittian theory, Schmitt defined this in two terms. He defined it as a defensive posture. He lamented that politics could be driven to a friend-enemy state. He also accused liberalism of obscuring the fact that the ultimate conflict is capital P political, between friends and enemies. It can escalate to being existential, and actually liberalism mires this in procedure and endless infernal discussions and blinds you to those existential threats, so it can just take you out in one fell swoop, so it should be avoided. But Schmitt didn't want things to become friend-enemy, existential. He didn't want justice to be defined as the guy in Plato's Republic, whose name translates to warlord, who I'm forgetting right now, but who defined justice as doing right by one's friends and doing punishment to one's enemies. He didn't like that it could get there. He just recognized that it would. And so you need to acknowledge the friend-enemy principle exists and defend your way of life by realizing that people will try to drive it to extinction and cannot be negotiated with. It doesn't mean every political disagreement is existential, but it means that some will be, and acknowledging that fact prevents you from being driven to extinction. And also Schmitt saw this in eschatological terms. He wrote in Roman Catholicism and the Political Form about the need for politics to have some things beyond the liberal drive to mechanize and instrumentalize everything, to render it comprehensible. Instead, politics needs to maintain its capacity for representation, just as the incense at Mass is waved around during the consecration of bread and wine, turning it into the body and blood of Christ. These things point to mysteries, things that we can't necessarily understand, things that are beyond human comprehension, so we have to have the humility to understand that is above our station. And so Schmitt saw the existential conflicts of friend and enemy as the same as the injunction in Matthew to prepare yourself because you don't know the hour or the day at which the Son of Man will return and judge you. You don't know the day when an existential crisis, a calamity befalls you. So you need to be cognizant of friend-enemy politics so that you are prepared to confront that existential crisis rather than just being blinded by liberal neutrality and thinking you can talk about the problem until it goes away. Jeremy Boering doesn't understand this because he hasn't read Schmitt. What he's promising instead is more willful blindness to those existential calamities, like the anti-white confiscation of property by the Democratic Socialists of America. There's no real answer from a non-friend-enemy framework to that kind of existential ethnic politics, of which the anti-white side is the aggressor, and white Americans and Brits and the like are just defending themselves against the confiscation of their property and their lives. And so during the podcast, they diagnose the conditions that have driven these young men to becoming what Groypers are, which would then mean that these young men have clear political aims, and they're not just nihilists who want to burn everything down, but we're not going to address contradictions here, otherwise we'd be here for even longer than their 2-hour podcast.
College graduates graduate heavily in debt. There are no good jobs for them. And so they get sour. They turn on their open their phones, turn on their laptops, and they're getting propagandized by the anti-Semitic far right, the racist far right, or the far left, and just saying, you're a victim. You're a victim. What's happened to you is somebody else's fault. And we saw this with wokeness. It was a way of coping with anxiety. It allowed you to offload all of your anxieties onto the other, the white, male, Christian, heterosexual. But now so many of our own young men on the right are doing the same thing. And there is a kernel of truth to what they say. We know that they have been denied job opportunities, educational opportunities because of their race and their sex. That was wrong. But guess what? We can fix that within liberalism. The answer cannot be to therefore mimic these woke identity politics people and bring it to our side.
No, that's not true. And so woke right, or Groyper now as it's mutated into, reveals itself as being not just you noticing that you are discriminated against, not just you recognizing that there is an anti-white state prohibiting you from getting job opportunities or college placements, that's ruined the economy, that's pushed the prospect of home ownership and a family out of reach for many men who aren't capable of earning more than the rate of inflation. It's not just you noticing it, it's you wanting to do something about it. It's you recognizing these intolerable conditions are optional, and you saying, no thanks, I'd rather revert back to the peace and prosperity that generations before me enjoyed. And those same generations are turning around and saying, well, if you want to do something, you're basically Hitler 2.0, you're woke right, you're a Groyper, you're an anti-Semite, you're a racist, you're far right, and we can't let you anywhere near power. We have to gatekeep you out of the side that is meant to be taking your side. We have to shut the doors of the institutions that should be your refuge from all the other institutions that have closed their doors to you because you're a straight white man. We have to gatekeep you out too. And then you expect these people to what? Just evaporate into the ether? Just to disengage from politics entirely? Or to say, you know what? Yeah, you are right. I'll accept not being able to wield political power in my interest just as every other group is doing at my expense. I'll forfeit my right to take my own side just to get along? You think that you have any currency with these people by offering this? No, liberalism doesn't provide the answer because liberalism is still susceptible to pleas of inequality and oppression. Liberalism has either produced, or at the very least been parasitized by, wokeness, which says we share the same anthropology as the liberals, we share the colorblind, egalitarian vision, we think that every human being is a blank slate, that race is purely a sort of cosmetic add-on like a video game skin, it has no moral or practical consequences in the world, it doesn't affect how you show up in the world, and so if there's any inequality between groups, that's the consequence of poverty or upbringing or culture or oppression, and so all these things can be remedied by the state. And if you aren't remedying it, well, then you must want that oppression. And of course, the squishy conservative goes, oh, no, I'm actually a liberal too, and I don't want to be accused of racism, and I'm going to assume you are acting in good faith. So here's my country, here's my political system, you should use it, just don't go too far. Because going too far would be wokeness, and, well, I can't really police your side because you don't really care about what I say, but what I can do is tone police my own side by accusing them of being woke, when all they want to do is just undo your use of power, which I allowed you to use, because I was susceptible to your special pleading. I had no moral arguments against the magic words you used to take my country away from me and all of these young men. Liberalism does not have the answer. Liberalism got us into this mess. And so it's going to take a lot of anti-liberalism. It's going to take using power and taking our own side to fix it. And that's why young men want to do that. And that's why your message isn't cutting through to young men. That's why you're not actually talking to young men. Instead, you're just, as Dave Green said in an excellent recent stream, you are just locking yourself in an echo chamber with donors and people of a certain age and just reciting the same old platitudes as a kind of self-soothing mechanism.
It's paper thin. Like these answers. I mean, like Jay Burden is on his like fourth. My friend Jay Burden from the Jay Burden podcast is on his like fourth week of Seth Dillon, Jeremy Boering watch. It's just him exacerbatedly reacting to all of these shit economic takes from the Babylon Bee guys, and saying the exact same things that I'm saying right now. It's all the same takes. These takes wouldn't stand a second. And what's so depressing, and kind of I came to this realization is, this is what Joel Berry's audience just wants to hear. They're boomers who are donors to the Republican Party. They like these bad takes. They like these bad takes. They want Joel Berry to give them these takes, even though they do not hold up for a second. Because it's cathartic, because it feels good, because it plays into a cycle. What boomers want to believe, and what conservatives want to believe, is America is really bad, but all we need to do is just make sure the Republicans win and keep on winning, and then America is going to get back on track. No structural reform is needed. And if there's any nefarious thing going on in the background, it can't have any causes like the Civil Rights Act or changing demographics or third worldism or any number of other scary things that might have them questioning their fundamental liberal principles. Those causes have to be done. Those nefarious radicalizations of the youth, they have to be the consequence of some communist conspiracy. The audience of Joel Berry does not want a discussion of these inconvenient facts about 20th century leftism or 21st century leftism. They just want to lecture young people. Their audience likes the fact that this is cringe. They demand this level of cringe.
As much as Rod says here, wokeness is a way to manage anxieties and externalize the locus of control to a phantom oppressor that's causing you to be a victim. All of these comfortable incantations about pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and capitalism being superior to communism, and if you want to fix inflation, you must be some kind of socialist, and everyone can become an American. It's all about values. All of these things are comforting lies that the donor class, the GOP, boomers, late Gen Xers, in both Britain and America, are telling themselves, and when young people who live with the consequences of those lies confront them with the undesirable products of their ideology being enacted in power on both the left and the right, well, they find it intolerable. They have an allergic reaction to the truth popping their consensus bubble. And so that's why they are the greatest enemy, rather than the people that they have allowed to take power, which the identitarian, young, vitalist right are responding to.
Because that corrupts our own heart. And it also gives us an excuse for not becoming men and women of virtue and integrity and of hard work.
Yeah. The Catholic integralists have a term, which is Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends, which is absurd on its face. At the end of the day, you become what you do. And if what you do is evil, even if you're doing evil in service of good in some abstract academic intellectual way, you cannot possibly actually be serving
That's
good.
what Stalin, that was his thing, you know.
Okay, but I don't think throwing people that celebrated the death of Charlie Kirk and want me dead in insane asylums, I don't think defunding the leftist patronage network, I don't think deporting people who shouldn't be in the country, I don't think expelling ideologies, cultures, religions that just don't belong in my country and cannot replicate my way of life, I don't think these things are evil or Machiavellian. I think this is the prudent use of power. I think it's moral, actually. And so I don't think that will contort and corrupt my soul. I think that's a completely reasonable way of defending your own civilization. Instead, this dichotomy just seems to present passivity as a virtue, and I just don't think that's the case. Anyway, the conversation continues, and at one point they say, well, you can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic, though that's a distinction without difference, because I've never actually heard anyone do that, and it doesn't happen in the Bible. It's like, okay, but the modern political nation-state of Israel, which is not the exact biblical territory, and also is secular and based on ethnicity by founding Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, is not the biblical Israel. This is just another sort of like boomer evangelical talking point that young people just don't go for. Dispensationalism is dead. It's just not persuasive. If you wanted to defend Israel, you could probably do it on nationalist grounds. That's not my prerogative. I'll leave that to people that want to do that sort of thing. But then you wouldn't be able to maintain the double standard that says Israel is a sacred nation-state and is a nation-state that needs to exist in the aftermath of the Holocaust to protect Jews, but also you have to be a nation of values, tolerant of all religions, and anyone can become one of your countrymen by just agreeing with your values. And your country isn't actually for you, because to say that would be woke right identity politics, and you're no different to the left that wants to take your country away from you by force. But to put a full stop on why the GOP are petrified of the Groypers, the woke right, radical young men who want to seize and use power for their own much more moral interests against their enemies who already have power and prepare to use it against them. To put a full stop on why the establishment GOP is scared of young men and actually has no persuasive case for why they should abandon that dream of using power for their principled abstinence against it, is because Rod Dreher, just a couple of weeks after putting out that podcast with Jeremy Boering, decided to respond to a post saying, it's a very important essay on the West's lack of will to survive by retired NSA analyst. Key line, if you fear being called a racist more than you value the survival of your people, don't expect your people to survive very long. But in order to secure the survival of the American people, people need to use power to expel people from the country who shouldn't be there. And you call that racist. You call that far-right, anti-Semitic. It's literally Weimar, is what you said. So this dizzying inconsistency just cannot be sustained. The people that the GOP establishment, and in Britain, are afraid of are the products of their own failure. And so if they're not going to include us in the conversation, if they're not going to adjust their arguments to reflect reality, if they're just going to sit in their echo chamber and recite the same tired old talking points that have caused our country to be confiscated from us by resentful anti-white minorities, if they're just going to do that, we just step over them. Ignore. Continue building the movement, and unfortunately, this is an intractable blockage of discourse. It's very demoralizing, but we just have to play the waiting game. And it seems like time is on our side. Now, if someone does want to have a conversation about this, I'm happy to have it. But given my experiences of trying to have that conversation and being denied, censored, deplatformed, and smeared by loads of national newspapers, I won't be holding my breath. But take heart, because they wouldn't be running this op, they wouldn't be counter-signaling so hard, they wouldn't be shutting us out of the room if they felt secure in their position.